Now that all the secrets are out of the way.
All the secrets are spoken. Keep it secret. Keep it safe. My God.
My God.
Yeah. So, how'd you do?
I did okay.
Nice.
I did all right. I actually went back to the beginning because I feel like...
okay. Of the second treatise?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Not the first.
I started all over.
Yeah. It's like, that's...
No.
Okay.
I feel like in this one, too, it's just like, it also gets really repetitive.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like he's set... I'm reading something, and it's like, didn't he just say this?
Yeah. No, it is a little repetitive. And I mean, he certainly has refrains, too, where he's like, like the... talking about the common judge and how you're in the state of nature if you don't have a common judge kind of stuff. And also like reiterating like, and because all people are born free and they don't even have freedom to give their own freedom away, that kind of stuff.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I mean,
so for those just tuning in, this is week 2 of John Locke's second treatise on civil government.
But week 3 on John Locke.
Week 3 on John Locke. Week 2 on the second treatise.
It's just been a bonanza of Locke.
Yeah. He's not my fave either, I must say.
No. Yeah. Well, you're a hard man to please.
I'm missing who am I missing? I'm missing Nietzsche. He was more fun.
Nietzsche was fun, yeah.
Who else was fun? Maybe
Foucault
just him.
was kind of fun, even though
Foucault was kind of fun, but also like, what are you talking about?
Yes, but that was kind of fun.
Yeah,
but yeah, also very difficult to read. Yeah,
Lane was pretty fun, pretty easy to read.
Roosevelt Lane was probably maybe the most fun we've had.
Yeah,
what do you think? Dare I say?
Yeah,
I got somebody that for Christmas, but
wait, really?
Yeah.
Who? Somebody. You don't have to say.
I don't know if I should say, but it's
I want to know.
Yeah. If they're listening, they know. If they're listening, they know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was, I don't know. Yeah, it's funny. I don't know if they'll like it, but they should read it, as should everybody listening. All the legions.
Yep. So the stuff that we read today is a little bit tough to summarize in one fell swoop, I think, because it hits a bunch of different points.
Well, here's one summary, I would say. This is basically like, if you read this is exactly where we got our government from.
Oh, yeah, sure. you know the way the U.S. government works? They probably read Locke and were like, yeah, we'll do that, and we'll do that, and that, and that.
Essentially. I mean, again, I'd known that going in, but it really is kind of amazing how similar, what... I mean, it makes sense, right? Because, all the Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, everybody was reading Locke. Right. But it really is influential, and you can see exactly what he's talking about. He's talking about legislatures. He's talking about executives. He
doesn't really talk about our system of judicial review.
Yes, you're right. And also
that also wasn't in our original Constitution.
Well, but he does have the idea of a judge that judges everybody. Right. So in that sense, like a supreme judge, he doesn't obviously say Supreme Court, but that's a good point. And also he has he splits executive and federative power. Right. Mm-hmm. Federative power being basically the power, I think, of the society to make like alliances and make war and peace. That's all within the executive for us, whereas he splits it for some reason. But it's mostly, I would say, to summarize it then a little bit in more detail, it's just about Locke's conception of what a good government looks like. Right, sure. And that's really a commonwealth. He goes into just the details of the commonwealth. And then also when a government goes bad and the right of rebellion. Right. And that's why I wanted you to read parts of those paragraphs, because it sounds to me like he's saying we basically have a right to rebel once we feel our government isn't... So the paragraphs that you had me read are about
whether or not a conqueror has a right to somebody's children's property.
Is that what I had you read?
Yeah.
186.
I was reading it and I was like, why?
Hang on. There was something in there, though, that was interesting. I don't know if maybe we should come back to it. I guess I don't know how you...
182 to 186.
Right. I think it was more like 186.
Okay. I have something highlighted there, but...
Yeah, we can get to that.
Okay.
Yeah, it was having to do with, I think, the money and the rights. The idea, what I found intriguing was he was basically saying that no conqueror has a right to almost any land,
right,
and then also has no right to the kids and like the wives of the men who fought in the war,
right.
The people.
Although he keeps adding these weird asides that were like, unless it's to. Redress or unless it's in things that he like if he needs stuff because he's lost a bunch of stuff and he needs apples and stuff, he can go take their apples,
right,
unless again that will make it so that they can't survive or something. It's a really convoluted series
because it's complicated, but I think also the reason I wanted you to read it was because you had made a similar point about how, like, I think during Rosewater Lane talk, where it was like, Rosewater Lane was discussing how, I think a similar idea, how you shouldn't punish those. Well, not everybody used to think about war. War was just for a specific class of warrior types. And then, in the 20th century and 19th, you have like the total war. Right. Everybody is taking part of war. But Locke seems to also be taking that idea of like, if you're not actually fighting in the war, you shouldn't be punished from it. And I felt like that was a point you were making.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's true.
So I think that's why I wanted you to read it. But fine. We can... Should we? So we'll start. So we left off at chapter 9.
Right.
Of the ends of political society and government.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So the ends of political society and government. So one thing he keeps saying about what the role of government is, I feel like it sort of boils down to the public good.
Yes. Well, yes.
And the idea that once the government is not acting for the public good, that's when it becomes tyrannical. And he talks about that later when he talks about tyranny. Right. But I feel like I don't really have a good sense for what he means by public good. Public good is a term that I don't really grasp it.
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to, because it really, he also said the fundamental prerogative is to protect the property of the constituents of that society. So I think a lot of the public good comes from when people transgress against a constituent of the society, whether on their property, and their property including their being, right? It's really just trying to right the transgressions, specifically probably when they transgress the law of nature. I think that's a lot of what the public good is.
When they transgress the law of nature.
Yeah, the law of nature being, nobody has a right to basically kill you and steal your property and stuff like that. Right. And society's in place to sort of help forego that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So I think when he talks about public good, I think a lot of it's having to do with property and, bodily sort of...
Right.
Whatever. Being
to me, that's like private good. Like what I'm wondering is the use of the word public. Like property feels like a kind of a private property, right? Mm-hmm. Versus public property, which is I don't think he's really talking about much at all.
Well, here he says it at the end, and 'tis not without reason that he seeks out and is willing to join in society with others who are already united or have a mind to unite for the mutual preservation of their lives, liberties, and estates, which I call by the general name property. So he calls lives, liberties, and estates by the general name of property.
Right.
and society is for their preservation.
Right. And so what you're saying is you understand the public good as sort of being under that, the life, liberty, and estate.
I think so.
Umbrella.
Yeah.
Sure.
I hear what you're saying is that it's public and private are used in different, obviously, settings and mean a little bit of different.
Right. I mean, I don't think he says private very much at all, but he says public good a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think when he's saying that, he's just talking about the general good.
I see.
Probably in that case, the abstracted good.
Uh-huh.
Because, I mean, I think he was... this was before the utilitarian movement, or maybe he was one of the forefathers of it. I always think the utilitarians really came into their own in the 18th and really 19th century.
Sure.
But it is kind of, I also do think that there's a little bit of a utilitarianism there of like the good of the many outweighs the good of the few,
right.
Wrath of Khan kind of stuff, you know?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, do you think he's a good of the many outweighs the good of the few kind of person?
Yeah, I mean, he's already said that, I think, when we were talking about democracy last time.
Oh, I guess.
You know, and how every society is going to sort of go to the general will.
Right.
The majority will.
Right.
And, your points about tyranny of majorities are true, but, as I was actually listening back to our conversation, I was thinking... you can make the same arguments for when you get ruled by minorities also. It's like a minority can elect to genocide people just as well as a majority can.
Right.
It doesn't seem to be a proportion.
Well, I think
issue.
there are certain types of tyranny that are easier to do depending on proportion. So, like...
Sure. But there's still tyranny that's going to arise out of any sort, a minority-held rule or a majority-held rule.
But there are certain... But just because something happens democratically, I guess my problem with democracy is not that it has the capability of being tyrannical, but things are not legitimate simply because a majority of people say so. Like if you went out, if five friends went out for dinner... and four of them voted that the other one had to pay for it, that doesn't make that right or reasonable.
Right. No, I mean, I agree with that. Just in the same way that just because, one really hard-headed person says it's right doesn't make it right.
Right.
Or
if one of them is way straight, if one adult and four kids, and he, beats them up and takes all their money, that doesn't make that right either.
Right.
I'm not saying that tyranny is unique to democracy.
It sounded like, I feel like when we talk about democracy, it comes off that way, but I understand probably that's because you're also counteracting a general positive bias people have for democracy.
I'm saying that democracy does not prevent against tyranny. It's not a stopper against tyranny.
I think a well-reasoning public is the only thing that can stop against that, which is why I like that he is harping on this, like we talked about last time, the idea of reason. But so I'm just trying to see how we do this.
Well, I feel like the first bunch of chapters, I didn't get tons of notes or tons of things to talk about out of them. It was the later chapters that I thought had a little bit more juice to them. Was there anything in... Say before chapter is that 14, the prerogative bit, when he's talking about the rights of executives and legislatures and the Commonwealth and all that. Was there anything in there that you wanted to pull out?
Yeah, mostly definitions, just because I think that's like definition of a Commonwealth kind of stuff. Sure. I'm just trying to see. So the great, I think this is good, right? I've said this, but here he's saying it in paragraph 124. The great and chief end, therefore, of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. Mm-hmm. And, you then need to sort of establish laws. You need an indifferent judge.
Right.
And you need to also have power to actually uphold punishments. Those are sort of the three things that I think he's basically saying are necessary for a government,
right,
or a political society. Yeah. But yeah, in terms of going to chapter 10, of the forms of a commonwealth, he sort of takes, I guess you could say, almost the Aristotelian definition of governments, where you really just have monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy.
Right.
So he says...
in 133, he's got kind of a little explanation. Paragraph.
For a commonwealth?
Yeah. By commonwealth, I must be understood all along to mean not a democracy or any form of government, but any independent community which the Latines, I don't know.
I think the Latins probably, like the Romans
right,
probably.
signified by the word civitas, to which the word which best answers in our language is commonwealth, and most properly expresses such a society of men, which community or city in English does not. For there may be subordinate communities in government, and city amongst us has quite a different notion from commonwealth, and therefore to avoid ambiguity, I crave leave use the word commonwealth in that sense. Like, this is not that helpful to me.
I crave leave to use.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, in the sense in which I find it used by King James I.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he had it there at the beginning. You're right. He sort of just...
An independent community, but that's not very clear to me.
So it's for the form of government depending upon the placing the supreme power, which is the legislature. I think that's really what it is. And he says this in the paragraph right before. Right. So, yeah, for the form of government depending upon the placing the supreme power, which is the legislative, is being impossible to conceive that an inferior power should prescribe to a superior, or any but the supreme makes laws. According to the power of making laws is placed, such is the form of the commonwealth. What a way to say it. But he's essentially saying a commonwealth is one where the legislature has the supreme power.
Right.
And the only power to make laws.
Right. But then he goes on to talk about the whole prerogative thing, which kind of suggests that the executive has power to make certain types of rules and laws.
Well, it needs to execute the laws that have been made, but once it goes beyond the laws, it becomes a tyranny. He sort of discusses that.
Right, but it also has the ability to make something like laws in a situation where the legislature is too slow.
Yes, assuming that they don't decide that, it goes against the law, obviously. Right. Yeah. But yes, yeah. And I guess that would be our executive powers probably here, right?
Right.
Yeah, and then we already know what democracy and oligarchies and monarchies are, right? Okay.
Who is it who said that democracy always tends towards oligarchy?
What
was his name?
It was Mikel.
That's
think.
right.
Yeah.
That was a better one too.
Yeah, the iron law of oligarchy.
Yeah,
that's a good one.
Forgot about that one.
Yeah, no, I think and honestly, like, I remember finding, like, talking to people about that on Reddit. Mm-hmm. Everybody, I feel like once you explained it clearly, everybody's like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Mm-hmm. That everything devolves into oligarchy. Right. And he kind of talks about this, like the idea that this is why you need the legislature to be ever changing and also not always in session.
Right.
To avoid, like, he understood that oligarchies have a tendency to form, and that if it's the same people that are legislating over and over again, and if it's like always in session, then you're going to get some kind of oligarchy to form. Little did he know that we still have an oligarchy to sort of fight against, but yeah anyway. So chapter 11. Yeah, chapter 10 is nice and quick. of the extent of the legislative power. First law of Commonwealth equals establishing the legislative power. That's what I have.
Nice.
And that, yeah, it's the only supreme power of the Commonwealth. So we've already said that. However, but yeah, so this is something he harps on a lot, is that even though it is the supreme power, the legislative does not have absolute arbitrary power over the lives and fortunes of the people, for it being but the joint power of every member of the society given up to that person or assembly, which is legislator. It can be no more than those persons had in the state of nature before they entered into society and gave up to the community. For nobody can transfer to another more power than they have over themselves.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's an important thing. A second important thing is the legislative or supreme authority cannot assume to itself a power to rule by extemporary arbitrary decrees, but is bound to dispense justice and decide the rights of the subjects by promulgated standing laws and known authorities, judges.
Nice.
Yeah. There's just like three. So there's a third thing that I think has to happen, is necessary for legislatures and commonwealths, that the supreme power cannot take from any man any part of his property without his own consent.
Right.
We certainly see that in our government today. And then the fourth thing is the legislative cannot transfer the power of making laws to any other hands. Mm-hmm. For it being but a delegated power from the people, they who have it cannot pass it over to others.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a nice summary at the end of this chapter that sort of establishes these are the bounds of the legislative power, essentially, that I just talked about.
Right.
Promulgate established law for the that law. Yeah, I already said them, so I won't say them again. But yeah, that's basically chapter 11.
Right. So a question that comes to mind is, what do you think of this idea of kind of laying out a rule book for a government, either like this in a philosophical text or in something like a constitution, and then a situation where the very people who have to uphold the rule book are the ones who are in charge of the rules? So even in his situation, the legislature can't do this, and this. And I feel like, for instance, the situation we live in, the legislature does that, and there's people that argue they should, and there's people that argue that they shouldn't, but they just do it. And then I guess from a Lockean perspective, time for revolution or something like that.
So you're asking, how do I feel about a
so
rule book
basically,
like this being made?
Sometimes I get a little bit tired of people arguing that something is or isn't following the Constitution, and this is kind of where my brain was going when we were talking about this just now. Because to me, it's so obvious that we're not doing anything about it anyway, that it's kind of a moot point. It's sort of a boring point. Like, yeah, they're not following the rules of the Constitution. So what? They have all the guns.
Yeah.
So what I'm wondering about is how useful coming up with some grand scheme of how a government should work is. Unless you're really going to follow it. Because this is the thing, is him ending it with the right of rebellion, I think it's a very potent thing to end it with. Mm-hmm. But it also shows that it only works if you're willing to do that. Yeah.
Well, no, so, I mean, to answer your question quickly, I think it's very important.
Uh-huh.
And I think the impact of this on philosophy and political thought is sort of emblematic of how important it is.
Right.
So this came out after the 1688 bloodless, glorious revolution, right? Where they established a constitutional monarchy.
Wasn't it written before, though?
Yes, but that's what I was going to say. It was written before, and he was hanging out basically with, I think, William and Mary in the Netherlands, right? Uh-huh. Just doing his little aristocratic thing, and also with what's his name, a very famous doctor. I always screw up his name. Starts with an S. Oh God, I was just reading about. Sildenheim. Sildenheim.
Nice.
Yes. Anyway, it's not a. Sildenheim.
I don't.
Anyway,
I don't.
It's remember. It's not a great easy name. He's an English guy. He's very important in the history of Western medicine. And there's a Korea named after him.
Oh.
Korea, not Korea.
Okay.
Like Korea. Doesn't matter. Anyway, so what am I saying? Sorry. I'm saying that it's very important, and I think, whether it engendered any sort of, of the actual revolution in his day, it certainly engendered the revolution of the American Revolution, as we've already discussed, and they basically used this playbook to try to make a more perfect union, right?
Right.
And I would say that they were getting it right until, of course, entrenched powers from Europe came and sort of re-exerted their old world control, as Rosewalder Lane might put.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole thing. I mean, you could start with just Andrew Jackson fighting against the central bank idea, right? I mean, there's been people trying to get their grips on the American power for a long time because of all the land and obviously resources and everything like that. And I would say they finally do obviously have their grips on it, they being just powerful people with money. And most of the powerful people with money came from Europe back in the day, right?
I see.
That's all I'm saying.
So you're saying Europe sucks?
Yes. No. Of course.
Yeah.
I'm saying they're always trying to control things.
So you're damn you, Europe.
Yeah, and so I think it's very important is the bottom line, because I think it gets people thinking about how they look at their own scenario and they're like, hey, actually, yeah, that's right. We are actually free, and the best political societies are ones that are formed by consent of a population,
right?
And we're not really seeing that right now, and maybe we should do something about it.
and then a follow-up question is, I've asked similar questions on the podcast before, but what do you think it is about many people that if you start talking to them about a consent-based system, there's a lot of sort of eye rolling and like, that's not realistic, that's not practical?
Well, I can tell you, because I mean, that's me, right? You were telling me that, and it's like, I still have this issue where it's you can't delegate everything perfectly,
right?
And when you have a complicated system like the U.S., where you have just millions of people doing things on their own watch,
right? People can't check with you about everything.
Yes, and nor do you want them to. I mean, you've managed people before. It's like you don't want to have a group of people where everybody's constantly coming to you, asking you like, what's the next move I should do here? You need to train them well,
it's true,
so that they can make decisions themselves.
There can be sort of, especially in low-level interactions, like personal interactions, there can be all sorts of levels of consent that are happening simultaneously.
Yes. But we also talked about this, and I think, the fact that you have like lots of little sort of things that you don't need consent on that you can do. But I would say, or is that what you were saying? Sorry, I cut you off.
I mean, I guess it's not that you don't necessarily need consent. I think there are situations where multiple types of consent can be assumed unless spoken otherwise.
Right. And it's like, my thing is, I feel like what happens...
I don't mean anything. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, we're not talking about...
No, I'm not talking sex stuff at all.
Yes, we all agree consent is very, very necessary in all things having to do with sexual relations. Yes. We're talking purely political right here.
Yeah.
Although, yeah, it's obviously a loaded word these days.
Well, the reason I'm bringing it up is I actually made a note about it because he does talk about consent a fair amount, especially with respect to sort of consent of the governed. I don't think that's quite how he puts it, but
no, I think that is kind of how he puts it.
Right. I don't think that's the language he uses exactly. But my question whenever he says that is, how is this consent determined, especially when we're talking about large groups of people with small legislatures making large rules or big, important rules?
I agree, and I think that's where his guidebook fails, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's like, even when he was starting to get into some of the nuances, like you mentioned with the conquering stuff, he was starting to address some of those like nuances that you'll get when you're actually like, okay, yeah, but you have a conqueror, and maybe sometimes they spend some money that they need to make back, so yeah, you can take some land. But
I mean, that's almost silly. I don't even get where he's coming from.
Right. Well, but yeah, he's just trying to.
It's like poor guy lost.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But I think that's why it is so general, and it's the benefit of generality.
Right.
Because every situation is going to call for a very specific thing. And in that setting, you need the people who are on the ground thinking about the scenario to make the decision. You don't want some general principle necessarily to guide it. I mean, you do want it, but like you need to take in probably very specific details for the scenario that's happening. So, and I was just going to say, like, with me, there's lots of like benign decisions that get made in governments that don't need consent, in a sense of like, or they don't need the consent of their superior officer, whoever it may be in the government. Mm-hmm. But it's like you have millions of these things happening that it then balloons into a big non-consensual government, right?
Hell yeah.
Should that be the title?
Yeah. Sounds problematic to me. Yeah. That's pretty good. But yeah. Well, I think his bit about legislators can't pass off the role of legislation to other people. That's a power they've been granted with by the consenting sort of citizens or whatever. And that's not something that can be passed off. I think what you're talking about, though, is I feel like one of the bigger problems that we have right now is those unelected, those committees that are formed. EPA, the Department of Education, all these weird departments that are filled with people unelected who are granted it's not technically legislative power, but they're granted the ability to make rules for people.
Right. Well, and then the people enacting those rules are often contractors too, or NGOs and stuff. They're not like it's a further abstraction away from the center of power.
And then the problem is that most of those rules, as you said, are benign. Mm-hmm. One of them doesn't really matter one way or the other. It's like school curriculum has to include these particular books for funding or whatever. I don't even know if it's that, but just like it's just something silly. It's just some rule. But the problem is that any of those rules, sort of in my mind, by Locke's definition, are tyrannical. Mm-hmm. And by virtue of the fact that the legislature has done that and has created these sub-organizations of unelected people to make rules, like then the next thing that has to happen is revolution, right? Or they have to stop doing it.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, it's tough. Yeah, because I mean, I'm the same way. You can't read this without thinking like, oh, well, then I guess we should be. I guess we should be revolting then.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Or you can disagree with it. Not everybody agrees with Locke. I was doing a little bit of sort of side. I was listening to some lectures on him and stuff, and I feel like especially in a lot of academic circles, he's not really a hero anymore.
That's interesting.
I think the biggest thing is that they say that he helped organize the slave trade.
I was reading about that too. Yeah, because he was like on the board of organizing the Carolinas.
Carolina,
right?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And
although apparently the defense against that is that he was really just like an underling. But I don't know.
I don't know. To me, it's like, are we going to take this paragraph that he wrote? Is that what's important about him, or is what's important about him that he was a dick? I don't know.
I don't know. Yeah.
Like, I'm not reading about it because I think he was like an awesome dude. I don't actually care. I care about what that paragraph says. And is it something we should take on as wisdom or not? Yeah.
Yeah. The context of the personality matters a little bit because you got to gauge where is he coming from with all this.
Sure.
But I think I agree. And I was reading that more because it's like it was kind of actually echoing what we were saying, how it was weird that he didn't talk more about slavery,
right,
in his slavery section because he had hands-on experience with it,
right,
or at least maybe not hands-on, but he had to deal with it on some level when organizing the Carolinas,
right. Was it that section, or was it a different section where he talked about the one case where slavery is acceptable?
It was with the despot stuff, where if you get conquered, right?
If somebody's conquering you and you beat them,
yeah,
you can essentially delay your killing of them by enslaving them,
right? Because
slavery is tantamount to death,
right? Then no, I don't. I mean, because that was in the conquering part,
right.
So that's not what you're talking about.
I think it is. I think I think it is. Maybe
it's not. That was in that paragraph, 186 or whatever. But yeah, only if they attacked you first. If you were the aggressor, then you were at any point there. It's okay for somebody to come in and redress you.
I think the other big argument against him is that he was arguing for unchecked capitalism and ushered in the evil capitalist world of the 17 and 1800s in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't even know that I agree with that, but it's an argument against it.
Yeah, it's tough. Because you could also look at like his writings as, again, like I think I've seen he's like the father of liberalism,
right?
Because it's like everything you read in here, again, is about how everybody's basically free,
right?
And so that's why it's like whatever he did, slavery wise, obviously it doesn't absolve him of that. It doesn't seem like he actually owned any slaves, but I don't know that. But if you just read what he's saying, it seems that he does not think that it is a good thing.
Right.
And I think that's revolutionary for the time right there. You know what I mean? Which exemplifies why he's so important. And again, just the fact that you had a lot of people arguing for absolute monarchies.
Right.
And I think if he doesn't go far enough on all the freedom stuff, it's just because he was living in a time where people were still, like, it wasn't a laughable concept that you would have absolute monarchy.
Right.
Whereas it's like that we've come so far from there. It's like you tell somebody that now, this is why everybody laughs at Curtis Yarvin. Right. It's like, this guy's a monarchist. That's hilarious. What is this guy? It's like, what the hell? And I think he's a big part of that, is I guess the point, And again, I just can't say it enough. I feel like this idea that, again, the U.S. obviously picked up on the founders when they were writing the government of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. I mean, that I think it basically comes from him, right?
Right.
And again, not even the U.S. has gotten it right, but they've gotten it a lot better than most countries in the world, I would say.
Nice.
I would say.
Your Team USA.
As much as I can be, yeah. I think so.
Yeah.
I think
Nice.
so.
So what do you think his most important, or what do you think he's most right about?
That idea that everybody is free in the state of nature, and it's sort of reason that makes us not go on murderous rampages, taking other people's property. It's, this idea of empathy kind of stuff. I think that's like, if everybody could just remember that more, we'd be a lot better. But it's tough because I think we also live in a society that we brutalize a component of our society just for it to continue existing. And if you're being brutalized, you're sort of being pushed into an animal state. And I'm talking about people that are like working really difficult jobs where it's like you almost have to be hardened to do certain jobs.
Right.
And, And you don't want to be thinking too much, honestly, about like, why am I doing this? Like our society still functions with a lot of people like this, which is, I think, why we still have these issues. But yeah, I think that's maybe the most important thing. What do you think?
I mean, I think the revolution point is the most potent. Because I feel like what it does is I don't know if it's a right or wrong thing. So I need to think about my own question a little bit about what I think he's most right about. But I think that adding that in there is what makes his point have any value at all. And I think otherwise it's just I think a government should be this. And it's so what? But it's actually saying, no. Like, it's not even just me. It is up to all of those who need to be consenting to consent or withdraw consent. And how do a governed people withdraw consent? They can't just say, no, I didn't agree to that. Because no ruler was ever going to listen to that.
No, yeah. It's a good point. I was just thinking, how could you withdraw consent?
That way. Off with their heads, right? The French did it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's like we actually don't talk about this that much, but the English also did that. They executed, I think, Charles I, was it?
Right.
Yeah. And it was during Locke's early time. Like, he was a young, maybe like 20 when that happened.
Right.
And I wonder if that must have had a big impact on him.
Right.
Yeah, sorry, but yeah, no, I mean, I agree to an extent, because I think also it is possible to do that peacefully. And this is the great sort of thing about the 1688 revolution, because it was relatively bloodless. I'm sure some people died. But I think, especially for the time, it was kind of peaceful.
Right.
But I think that was mostly just because, like, the Scottish had they were, sort of to your point, it's like, I think Scotland was a lot of the muscle back then, and they basically decided to go against the king and let William and Mary come in.
There wouldn't need to be a bloody revolution if, say, the police and the military just didn't do what the government said.
True.
Because they wouldn't have anybody to go kill people for them.
Right. Yeah, right.
But that's tough. I mean, that's probably not going to happen. But
yeah.
I'm also not saying that there should be a revolution. I'm just thinking about his idea.
Well, I'm not. You save that for the FBI.
Right, save that. Hey, FBI.
Hey, by the way, for the record, I'm not either.
I'm glad you added that.
Plausible deniability, damn it.
AMX.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. But I'm true. That's a good point.
But I'm not.
Right. So do you think...
No, but yeah.
I wonder what Locke would think about the situation today?
Yeah, I don't know, because, it's also like he still had a very paternalistic, and when I say that, I mean like that he was an aristocrat, Right. I mean, so I think he still had a elitist mentality, like those poor commoners can't really govern themselves.
Right.
Even though, again, everything he's saying makes it out to sound like he thinks everybody can. He keeps harping on reason.
Yeah.
And I think, he would probably be of the opinion that a lot of people that he was living with in his time in the lower classes in England didn't have the same reasoning capabilities. So I don't know. I think, I don't know. Okay, so you're posing questions. What do you think?
About what Locke would think today?
Yeah.
The reason I'm curious is I would say that most Western governments today obviously fit into his definition of tyranny.
You want to provide examples?
Well, like my example with the U.S., with the legislative bodies creating secondary organizations to make rules of unelected people. And I would say that is a system that is in place in many Western governments. The creation of regulatory organizations outside of the people making the laws. So just like that simple fact sends them into tyranny. And then there are much more complicated issues about whether or not those legislative bodies and the executives are providing for the public good or the common good of the people. And part of the reason I get so hung up on that term is I feel like it's a very difficult term to argue. Because if somebody believes that they are doing something for the public good, how is it determined that they are or they aren't? Because good as an idea could mean, making everybody, take medicines that they don't want to take because it will make them less prone to getting diseases. And it isn't even just medicine. Like there could be many things that the people feel is bad and don't want to do, but the people in charge might suggest they need to do, in the same way that a parent says, you have to brush your teeth as a kid, even if you don't want to brush your teeth or something like that. Is that for the public good? That kind of is for the public good. And so then how are the people being governed ever able to determine what the public good is if the people in charge really know what's best?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because I actually think that he might be against mandates.
Right.
And it's actually interesting because he lived during, I'm sure variations might exist of what he had about smallpox variolation, which was, the way that you could prevent against smallpox. A lot of the same conversations we have about vaccines, they were having back in, I guess it didn't come to England until the early 1700s, so maybe he wasn't. But it became a big question because I was reading stuff from David Hartley, who was living around the 1730s in England, and it was this question of like, I mean, they didn't have the centralized control to mandate variolation, but a lot of doctors were saying like everybody should be getting this because it'll prevent smallpox. But you had a lot of the issues that you have today is you have different practitioners are doing the procedure. Some are going to be better than others. And, then you have complications from the procedure. It's like, so that for all those reasons, it's not so simple to say everybody should get it because there's a cost benefit analysis to be done. And so I think Locke might just take the opinion of like, you can't force anybody, you can't do anything to somebody's property without their consent, right? And their property being their body, as we've already discussed.
Right.
So that's kind of why I think he would probably fall in line for that.
So then my other question for him, excuse me, Mr. Locke.
Am I Mr. Locke now?
Yeah, you should get a pipe.
I should.
Yeah. I wonder what he would think about taxation then.
I'm glad you asked. I literally have that open.
Oh, nice. Did I miss it?
Yeah, so he has that in paragraph 140.
Okay, I must have just skimmed over it.
'Tis true, governments cannot be supported without great charge, and 'tis fit everyone who enjoys his share of the protection should pay out of his estate his portion of the maintenance of it. But it must be with his own consent.
Aha, so he's the same as Ayn Rand again.
Yes, i.e. the consent of the majority.
Nice.
Giving it either by themselves
Sweet.
or their representatives chosen by them. For
Right.
if anyone shall claim a power to lay and levy taxes on the people by his own authority, and without such consent of the people, he therefore by invades the fundamental law of property and subverts the end of the government. For what property have I in that which another may be right take when he pleases to himself anyway?
So in Locke's version, perhaps my situation where 5 people go out to dinner and 4 of them vote that the 5th one has to pay, the 5th one has actually consented to pay in that situation.
Yeah, maybe. If they say, I consent to be part of this group and to submit to the will of the group.
Right, and the Japanese consent, they interned themselves, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah, I suppose so.
Yeah.
I doubt that's how they would look at it, but yeah.
Well, I don't think that's how they would look at it. No, it's his. So it's like the individual consent, i.e., the consent of the majority, and I get it. I understand that because the idea is, we vote in legislators who win by majority rule.
Right.
Therefore, any rule that they make has already been consented to by the individual. It goes up. The individual has consented because the majority consent is the same as the individual consent. And then the legislator's consent is the same as the majority's consent.
Right. But this is where, like, in the case of the internment camps, whereas I think those are also something Locke would be against because it was... They were seizing property. I mean, they were seizing their bodies and also...
But those things can all be seized through consent. He says it all the time.
No.
Life can't, but property can.
Well, but life is property, remember?
Right, but life is a specific type of property. You can consent to have your property taken.
It's the most fundamental. And it's not... You can't take it without them saying it's okay. Like, I mean, granted, this is maybe where some of the nuance comes, right? But that's what he says in the 4th, is it? Yeah, legislate, or in the 3rd one. Supreme power cannot take from any man any part of his property without his own consent, for the preservation of property being the end of government.
Right, but his own consent, now he doesn't have an i.e. the majority's consent there.
No.
But do you think he there's a distinguish? So I guess maybe he is distinguishing. But then, what are the things that the majority can consent for the individual for, and what are the things that the individual is the only person who can consent?
I mean, I see what you're saying because you're saying taxes are basically taking property, right?
Definitely.
But it's by consent in that case. You're like, okay, I'll be part of this society, and you require.
But consent
10%.
Is majority consent. I can't say, even according to Locke, I can't say I individually do not consent to taxes.
No, but you can, but then it'd be like, well, then you can't live in this society.
Right.
That's how it should probably work in Locke's idea. And that's why I'm saying that the internment camp is like a step beyond the taxes scenario. It's not a proportion of your property, first off. It's your whole being, and it's also you're excising yourself away from the property that you have to begin with.
So what if it was you have to be interned for 10 minutes a day?
See, I still think that would be against what Locke would say. It would be going too far into the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness aspect of property.
Mm-hmm. Because taxes now are dollars, but taxes haven't always just been dollars. Like you used to be able to pay your taxes in tobacco and things like that,
and chickens.
So other types of property. So a tax could be we get 5 shingles off your roof, or we get a portion of your land. We get 3 square feet of your land, or it could be whatever. And you don't get individual consent in that situation. That's based on majority consent.
I mean, you're right. There is a society. You're saying, is there a society where you could consent to be interred as a tax? Probably. Would that be a society?
Well, I don't know that the society wants it.
And I guess what I'm saying is that I think that is enough of a violation of the law of nature, which he puts that as the supreme power.
Right.
Beyond the legislator, because the legislative is basically supposed to, as we've said, avoid transgressions against the law of nature.
Right. To me, the property, where I'm getting hung up, and maybe I'm misunderstanding him, and I'm getting it confused with my own opinion. I'm trying not to do that. I'm trying just to see where the line on his is. But my understanding is that your property, based on the section on what property is an extension of your labor, which is an extension of your life force. Right?
Yeah, I think so.
And so if property is able to be consented for to be consented to be taken by not just you, but the proxy of you in the majority, what about your labor, and then what about your life? I think that he would say definitely not your life, right? Your labor seems I don't know. Probably not. And then your property, I would say he generally says no, except with respect to taxes. And then I don't understand how taxes are any different than anything else, because anything that the government is seizing from you is essentially a tax.
Yeah. I think it's just it's like taxes are that one example where the government needs to take some of your property, but it has to be done by consent. And you're right. I see what you're saying, whereas you could say that a tax is like a shingle, or a tax is you spend 10 minutes in a cage every week,
right,
or whatever.
Right.
But I think that might then, again, especially with the spending 10 minutes in a cage thing, I'll say it again, I think that's starting to get into transgression of the law of nature. I don't think the shingle one is as much, though. I think,
right.
Conceivably.
But what about your land in terms of acreage? Like if they were taking amounts of your land rather than specific things?
No, I mean, it seems like he would probably, to answer your question, it does seem like there's a hierarchy of property. That seems to be what you're asking, right?
Right. Well, the reason I was like life, labor, and then property, because to me that's the flow of his argument about property.
Yeah, and I do think, as we've already, and we could get to this, when he talks about the conquering, he makes a point of how, it's like taking somebody's land after they've been conquered, you're basically stealing their posterity from them.
Right.
Which is, you're stealing their life force, in a sense, and that's
exactly.
not okay. Yes, so that's answering your point. I think that he would say that you can't have land taxes where every whatever so often the government seizes a portion of your land for obvious reasons, because then you're going to end up with no land and the government's going to have all the land first off, right?
Yeah.
And it does seem like he puts land at a higher value than labor.
Wait a minute. I thought you said labor was the highest value.
I was just joking.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I see where he's coming from. Like labor as in your life force is more valuable to you than a square of land, for sure. Your ability to work is way more valuable to you than any piece of land.
But then land might be the next valuable, and then like the assets that you like the bushel of wheat. You know, that's the next, valuable thing. And you know what I mean? It's like
I get it. It's just, I don't know where the cutoff is where something is valueless enough that other people can consent for you.
Right. Well, I think the idea is that nobody's supposed to consent for you.
But the consent of the majority is individual consent in this case.
Right. But then you can excise and leave that society, would be what he would say.
Right.
Yeah. And in which case, then you would probably be staying and actually be okay with it, I guess. Would maybe be what his argument would be.
Right.
And thus you become part of the majority.
Right.
Hooray.
I mean, I get it, and I don't even disagree to a point. Like, if I'm part of, the nature club, and they have their dues, and I don't want to pay them anymore, and so then I just can't be part of the club anymore. That makes sense. Right. It's a little tougher with respect to like
the government.
Yeah.
I don't want to play anymore, USA.
Yeah, I don't want to play. I'm out.
You're gonna play, and you're gonna like it. Yeah. So chapter 12, I agree. Also, probably not too much. We already also talked about, the difference between executive and federative power. Chapter 13 of the subordination of the powers of the Commonwealth. So this is again just kind of talking about how, so the supreme power is in the people because they can remove the legislative if they want, right? And that's what we keep saying. But then after that, it's the legislative, right? The people say we're going to put our power into the legislature, and they do with what they will with that. But he's sort of saying in this chapter, and thus the community may be said in this respect to be always the supreme power.
Nice.
But in all cases, while the government subsists, the legislative is the supreme power. So, well, but it's like if there's no government, then of course it's the community.
Right.
And then once you have...
Once there's government, it's the government. But ultimately, it's still the community because the community can remove the power from the government.
Exactly. You get it. You people get it. And he says, I say using force upon the people without authority and contrary to the trust put in them, that does so in a state of war with the people who have a right to reinstate their legislative in the exercise of their power. So if force is being used against them, that puts them into a state of war. This chapter really is the one about and here's on oligarchy. But I was going to say this is a chapter sort of calling into, the revolt kind of ideology we've talked about. But here's on oligarchy, that in governments where part of the legislative consists of representatives chosen by the people, that in tract of time this representation becomes very unequal and disproportionate to the reasons it was at first established upon. So I should have read from the first part of that sentence. To what gross absurdities the following of custom, when reason has left it, may lead, we may be satisfied when we see the bare name of a town, of which there remains not so much as the ruins, where scarce so much housing as a sheep cote, or more inhabitants than a shepherd is to be found, sends as many representatives to the grand assembly of lawmakers as a whole county, numerous in people and powerful in riches. He's just talking about how, it can get overbalanced and people are going to start to play the game. Right. Like in this case, you have a sheep, you have a town with nobody in it that has a bunch of representation, and a town with a bunch of people that have no.
Right. In a way, that's kind of that's what the certain aspects of the U.S. government are trying to address, right?
Well, that's the whole idea of the Senate having equal numbers, and the House of Representatives being based off of population.
Yep. So I have a gathering this evening in a little bit.
You do?
So I should
oh man,
I should wrap up pretty soon here.
Okay. Well, so Conquest, I think we talked about that.
Conquest. It makes me think of that the White Stripes song.
Oh yeah, Conquest. Reason governs man to man. I just think that's something he just keeps saying. I
feel like you should have that up on your wall.
I should.
It's the kind of thing you say to your son.
Yeah. From all which it follows that the government of a conqueror imposed by force on the subdued against whom he had no right of war, or who joined not in the war against him where he had right, has no obligation upon them. So that's kind of what we were saying before.
Yes.
If you impose something by force, the people have a right to rebel against you. Yeah. All right. Well, we've probably said it. So, usurpation is that the last chapter? I don't think it is.
No, the last chapter is about rebellion, right?
Yeah, and then he has one on the dissolution of government. Most are dissolved by foreign conquest, but then the next are dissolved from within. I think we sort of all understand that. And could be dissolution from executive negligence. And also dissolution from legislature acting against trust. And yeah. And then at the end, right, this is kind of a nice thing, though, is that because he's kind of addressing, like, the revolution point. He'd say, to this hypothesis lays a ferment for frequent rebellion, to which I answer no more than any other hypothesis. For when the people are made miserable and find themselves exposed to the ill usage of arbitrary power, cry up their governors as much as you will for sons of Jupiter. Let them be sacred and defined. Blah, 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 blah. The people generally ill-treated and contrary to right will be ready upon any occasion to ease themselves of a burden that sits heavily upon them, right?
Nice.
And, so.
Yeah.
Okay. Wait,
all
this
right.
last thing.
What?
Last thing.
All right.
Oh, yeah, because they had all this interesting stuff about Barclay we didn't get to. Okay, it's fine. I liked it overall.
Yeah.
Fine.
Me too. No. Fine.
Fine, Antushka.
No.
Leave me
but
here.
I want to talk about what we're going to talk about next week too.
Oh, yes.
Right.
Well,
so I have it in front of me. But so that's John Locke.
That's John Locke.
We've talked about
nutshell.
everything you could possibly talk about him. There's no more to talk about.
No.
Don't read it. Don't find out other things. Just listen to us.
Yeah, don't listen to anybody that says he has a whole other thing, on human understanding. It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Nothing happened.
All right.
Cool.
So next week we are reading. How do you pronounce it?
Dioscorides.
Dioscorides on pharmacy.
Ronnie James Dioscorides
and Medicine.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, on medicine and pharma. He was really a pharmacist in many ways, but they were sort of the same thing back in the day.
Nice.
I was actually reading through this today.
Nice.
I'm a little worried that it's going to be too much, but at least the first chapter should be good. But we might only be able to do one chapter because it's basically the rest of the book is him going through this historian.
I mean,
does a great
drug
job.
affinities sounds pretty fun.
Yeah, we can do that. But
animals, wines, and minerals.
Yes.
What a weird mix of things.
Well, that's how Dioscorides organized his
cool.
His pharmacopoeia.
I mean, these sound fun to me.
Yeah,
I'm into it.
He's basically going through it and talking about like the details of what he wrote about and stuff like that. So yeah, but the first chapter lays out some questions like you had of like what's a physician in Roman era going to be doing?
I see, okay.
How does it change? And so he talks about some of that stuff. But
and,
the rest
and
of
pharmacists at the time, did they still like count out pills and tell you to remember to eat food with them?
Well, kind of, probably.
Don't take it on an empty stomach.
Yes.
And I have a PhD for this.
There was more manure that was used than today, but for the most part, it was still, you have to...
And they tell you it's going to be about 20 minutes. You're going to have to walk around the store.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Same stuff.
Yeah, same stuff. Just different accent.
It'll be about 20 minutes. They're like Transylvanian. Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, he's Greek, for God's sake. But so he's a Greek physician, and we'll talk more about it. But yeah, I would say if we do chapter 1 for next week.
Let's do it.
And we're going to medicine. We're back to medicine.
For the third time or the second time? Second time. Second time. I'm excited.
My God. 1989.
Okay. All right.
1989.
Yes.
Okay.
All right.
See ya.
See ya.